Gavin Alden had spent his entire life building. First, it was model airplanes in his mother Eleanor's garage, then houses with his construction company, and finally a family he believed would withstand any storm. At 45, Gavin stood 6'2" with weathered hands and storm-gray eyes that missed nothing. His company, Pinnacle Structures, had transformed from a small residential contractor into one of Highvale's premier commercial builders. "You've always had your mother's determination," his father Clark would say, clapping him on the shoulder with what Gavin once mistook for pride. Gavin's wife Celeste played her part beautifully, the devoted spouse who managed their social calendar and charmed potential clients at dinner parties in their Doomside mansion. With her auburn hair and practiced smile, she'd been by his side for 18 years. Their son, Jonas, now 16, had inherited Gavin's analytical mind and his grandmother Eleanor's quiet resilience. The family fortune, primarily from Eleanor's side, loomed large in their lives. Eleanor Alden had built a real estate empire from nothing, working ruthlessly through the housing boom of the 1980s while her husband Clark managed the books. The inheritance would be substantial, with Gavin as the primary beneficiary. When Eleanor was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, Gavin spent every spare moment at Arid Meadows Medical Center. Celeste's visits grew increasingly sporadic as the weeks passed. "She's always been uncomfortable around illness," Gavin explained to his mother one afternoon, noticing how Eleanor's piercing blue eyes followed him with unusual intensity. "Some people can't face mortality," Eleanor replied, her once commanding voice now frail. "Others can't face the truth." 2 days before his mother slipped into her final coma, she asked for Jonas alone. Gavin thought nothing of it. Eleanor had always shared a special bond with her grandson. That evening, Gavin found Celeste in their bedroom, frantically texting. She jumped when he entered, clutching the phone to her chest. "Work emergency," she explained, though Celeste hadn't worked since Jonas was born. As his mother's condition deteriorated, Gavin noticed Clark spending more time at the hospital, not with Eleanor, but pacing the hallways outside her room, constantly checking his phone. When their eyes met across the hospital cafeteria, Clark's gaze slid away too quickly. The morning Eleanor died, Gavin was alone with her. Clark had left to get some air, and Celeste had texted that she was stuck in traffic. Gavin held his mother's hand as her breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. He sat there for nearly an hour afterward, remembering how she taught him to nail his first 2x4 when he was 8 years old. "Always check your foundation twice," she told him. "Everything that follows depends on it." Gavin never realized his own foundation was already crumbling beneath him. The Valley Rise funeral home filled with Highvale's business elite. Eleanor Alden's death at 68 had sent ripples through the real estate community. Gavin stood stoically greeting guests, his hand occasionally reaching to straighten his mother's photograph on the memorial display. Celeste arrived 20 minutes late in a black dress that hugged her curves inappropriately. Clark hovered near the refreshment table, accepting condolences with practiced solemnity. Jonas sat alone in the front row, unusually composed for a teenager facing his first significant loss. During the eulogy, Gavin spoke of his mother's strength and foresight. "She built not just buildings but legacies," he said, voice unwavering. "She taught me that true strength isn't in what you possess, but in what you protect." From his peripheral vision, Gavin noticed Clark and Celeste exchange glances, twice. When Gavin returned to his seat, Jonas squeezed his father's hand, a gesture so uncommon from the typically reserved teenager that Gavin felt his composure slip for the first time. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the reception hall, Gavin observed Celeste constantly checking her phone. She flinched when it vibrated during a conversation with Eleanor's former business partner. "Excuse me," she murmured, stepping away to check the message. Gavin followed, maintaining distance. From across the room, he watched her face transform, first surprise, then a flash of something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. She quickly texted back, then resumed her performance as the grieving daughter-in-law. 10 minutes later, Clark disappeared into the men's room, phone in hand. Gavin approached his wife as she accepted a glass of wine from a server. "Everything okay? You seem distracted." "Just some drama with the charity gala committee," she replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "Nothing important today." The lie hung between them. As guests began departing, Celeste set her empty wine glass down and excused herself to powder her nose. When she left her purse at their table, something cold and certain settled in Gavin's chest. He waited 3 heartbeats, then reached for her phone. No password. Celeste had always been careless that way, confident in Gavin's trust. He opened her messages and saw his father's name at the top of her recent contacts. The latest message read simply, "She's gone. We're free." Gavin's hands didn't shake as he scrolled upward through thousands of messages spanning years. Intimate exchanges, secret meetings, plans for after Eleanor's death. Discussions of Gavin's inheritance and how they would access it after taking care of him. And worse, much worse, mocking comments about Gavin's devotion to his mother. Celeste's complaints about Gavin's work ethic, and Clark's assurances that soon we won't have to pretend anymore. Gavin didn't realize how long he'd been standing there until he felt the hand on his arm. It was Jonas, looking older than his 16 years. "Dad," he said quietly, "they're ready to leave for the burial." Gavin slipped the phone into his pocket instead of returning it to Celeste's purse. At the graveside, Gavin stood between his wife and father as the casket was lowered. When Celeste reached for his hand, he let her take it, his face expressionless. Clark placed an arm around Gavin's shoulders, squeezing in mock support. Their touch felt like acid on his skin. The reception at the Alden mansion grew subdued as evening approached. Gavin moved mechanically through conversations, accepting condolences with empty thanks. His mind catalogued every interaction between Celeste and Clark. A brush of fingers when passing a drink, a lingering glance across the room, the way they seemed to communicate without words. In his peripheral vision, Gavin saw Clark check his watch repeatedly. Celeste had disappeared to the kitchen to supervise the catering staff. The pattern was clear now. When only close family remained, Gavin excused himself and found Celeste in their bedroom, changing shoes. Her phone, the spare she kept in her nightstand, lit up with a text. Gavin moved with surprising calm, plucking it from her hand. "What are you doing?" she snapped, reaching for it. Gavin held it away. Clark's message visible on the screen. "Meet me in 20. Back in Gavin's. Interesting. Planning another secret rendezvous with my father," Gavin said, his voice dangerously soft. The color drained from Celeste's face. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," Gavin said. "I read your messages. All of them." For a moment, Celeste's eyes widened with genuine fear. Then, remarkably, she laughed. A cold, brittle sound Gavin had never heard from her before. "Well, this is inconvenient timing," she said, straightening her shoulders. "We were hoping to have this conversation under more controlled circumstances." "We?" Gavin repeated. "Clark and I," she said, no longer pretending. "Though I suppose formalities are unnecessary now." Gavin's composure held. "How long? Does it matter?" 7 years, if you're counting." 7 years. Jonas had been 9. Gavin had been expanding the business, working 14-hour days. "Why?" The question emerged barely audible. Celeste's smile turned predatory. "At first, boredom. You were always working, and Clark was attentive." She shrugged. "Then we realized we had common interests, primarily financial ones." Gavin felt ice spreading through his veins. "My mother's money." "Your mother's empire," Celeste corrected. "Which would have been Clark's if Eleanor hadn't been so controlling." "Did you never wonder why she kept him sidelined all those years?" "She knew his potential. She feared it. She knew he was weak," Gavin countered. "A parasite. Visionary." Celeste shot back. "While you were playing with your little construction projects, Clark was seeing the bigger picture." Gavin laughed, the sound hollow. "And what picture is that?" The two of you running off with my inheritance after what? Eliminating me somehow. The words felt ridiculous saying them aloud, but Celeste's expression confirmed his worst suspicions. It wasn't personal, she said. Just practical. Eleanor changed her will last year, made things more complicated. Her eyes narrowed. We had to adapt our timeline. The casual way she discussed his planned elimination sent a cold wave of clarity through Gavin. He looked at this woman, the mother of his child, his partner of nearly 2 decades, and saw a complete stranger. I'm going downstairs, Gavin said, pocketing both phones. We'll continue this conversation with my father present. In the living room, Clark was checking his watch again when Gavin approached, Celeste trailing behind. Everything okay? Clark asked, his concern obviously performative. No, Gavin replied. Everything is not okay. He tossed Celeste's phones onto the coffee table. Recognition flashed in Clark's eyes. Let's not make a scene, Clark said quietly, glancing at the few remaining guests. Why not? Isn't that what funerals are for? Truth-telling. Gavin turned to face the small gathering. My father and wife have been having an affair for 7 years. They plan to access my inheritance after my mother died, possibly by eliminating me. Gasps echoed through the room. Clark's face hardened. You're grief-stricken, he said loudly, not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly, Gavin replied. Show them the messages, Celeste. Tell them about your plans. Celeste's expression shifted to cold amusement. Why bother denying it? Yes, Clark and I are together. Yes, we had plans for the inheritance. Your mother built an empire that Clark helped create. He deserves his share. My mother built everything despite him, Gavin countered. Your mother, Celeste said with sudden venom, knew about us for years, but was too weak to tell you. She suspected for years, confirmed it last year. She could have told you any time, but she protected you like the mama's boy you've always been. The words landed like physical blows. Gavin felt something fundamental shift inside him. Some final pillar of restraint crumbling. Before he could respond, Jonas stepped forward from the hallway doorway. Gavin hadn't realized his son was listening. That's a lie, Jonas said, his teenage voice cracking slightly. His face was pale but determined as he held up a USB drive. Grandma gave me this before she died. She told me to give it to Dad if anything seemed wrong after she was gone. She said it would protect Dad. Celeste lunged for the drive, but Gavin moved faster, placing himself between his son and wife. The remaining guests stood frozen, witnessing the family's implosion with horrified fascination. What's on it? Gavin asked his son. Everything, Jonas answered. Grandma knew what they were planning. She had someone watching them for months. There are photos, recordings, evidence of what they were going to do to you. Clark's face contorted with rage. Give me that drive. Boy. Get out, Gavin said, his voice deadly calm. Both of you, get out of my house now. Your house. Celeste laughed again. This house is part of Eleanor's estate, and with the new will. The new will designates everything to Jonas and me, Gavin interrupted. Mom told me about the changes months ago. You've been working with outdated information. You're lying. Clark spat. Try me, Gavin challenged. Now get out before I have you removed. As Clark and Celeste gathered their things, Gavin turned to his son. When did you know? He asked quietly. I suspected something was wrong last year, Jonas replied. Grandma confirmed it when she gave me the drive 3 days before she died. She made me promise to wait. Said timing was everything. Gavin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the last remaining person he could trust. We'll review it together, he said. And then we'll decide what happens next. As Clark and Celeste walked out the front door, Gavin felt something new replacing his shock. A cold, methodical fury that demanded satisfaction. The builder in him recognized when a structure couldn't be salvaged, when the only option was complete demolition before rebuilding. He watched them drive away, already calculating how to dismantle their lives piece by calculated piece. The house emptied of guests by midnight, leaving only whispers and shocked departures in their wake. Gavin sat with Jonas in his home office, the USB drive between them on the mahogany desk. "Are you sure you want to see this?" Gavin asked his son. Jonas nodded, his jawline, so like Elinor's, set firm. "Grandma made me promise to stick with you through whatever happens next." The drive contained dozens of files meticulously organized into folders: surveillance, financial, communications, contingencies. Eleanor Alden had been as thorough in death as she was in life. The surveillance folder held photos of Celeste and Clark together dating back 6 years, not 7 as Celeste had claimed, at high-end hotels, at a shore house Gavin didn't recognize, entering and exiting Clark's city center apartment. Some images showed them reviewing documents, heads bent together over papers spread across restaurant tables. "Miles Hinton," Jonas said, pointing to a notation on one of the files. "Your grandmother's security chief," Gavin confirmed. "She must have hired him privately for this." The financial folder revealed the true extent of Clark's betrayal. Not content with the affair, he had been systematically undermining Eleanor's business for years. Small sabotages, redirected investments, strategic mistakes that looked like bad luck but showed a pattern. What shocked Gavin most was evidence that Clark had been skimming from the business since before Gavin was even born. "Mom knew," Gavin whispered. "She knew and kept him around anyway." The next file explained why. A recorded conversation between Eleanor and her lawyer from 18 months earlier. "I've known about Clark's activities for decades." Eleanor's voice emerged from the computer speakers. "Initially, I stayed to protect Gavin from the scandal. Later, I kept Clark close because enemies are best watched directly. The affair with Celeste confirmed my suspicions that they would eventually target Gavin. The new will is my countermove." The communications folder contained intercepted text messages and emails far more damning than what Gavin had seen on Celeste's phone. The most recent exchanges discussed specific plans. Clark had found a doctor willing to gradually administer untraceable drugs that would mimic early-onset dementia, making Gavin appear incompetent to manage his inheritance. "They were going to poison you," Jonas said, his voice breaking. "Mom was going to poison you." Gavin placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "But they didn't get the chance." The contingencies folder contained Eleanor's masterstroke, her true will, different from the public one that would be read officially the next day, transferring all assets to an irrevocable trust controlled by Gavin, with Jonas as secondary trustee and beneficiary. Clark received nothing. Celeste's portion, originally a courtesy sum of $1 million, had been reduced to a token $1 after Eleanor confirmed the affair. "There's a letter for you," Jonas said, pointing to a Word document titled simply Gavin. Gavin opened it, his mother's voice seeming to rise from the words on screen. "My son, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've discovered the betrayal. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you from this pain. I kept silent not from weakness, but strategy. Clark and Celeste needed to believe their plan was working until my assets were properly secured beyond their reach. You've always been a builder, Gavin. You see potential where others see only rubble. But what you face now requires a different skill. The ability to dismantle with precision. Clark has made enemies throughout Highvale over the decades. Celeste has secrets beyond her affair with your father. The ammunition you need is in these files. Remember what I taught you about foundations. Theirs is built on sand. All you need to do is direct the tide. Whatever you choose, protect Jonas. He is innocent in this and stronger than either of us realized. With love and faith in your judgment. Mom." Gavin closed the file, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" Jonas asked. "Now," Gavin said quietly, "we get some rest. Tomorrow we begin." Later, alone in his room, Gavin didn't sleep. Instead, he reviewed the files again, making notes, identifying leverage points, mapping connections. By dawn, the builder had become an architect of a different sort, one who designed not structures, but systematic destruction. The will reading proceeded exactly as Eleanor had planned. Gavin watched Clark and Celeste's faces transform from smug anticipation to stunned disbelief as the lawyer, Sabrina Cole, detailed the irrevocable trust arrangement. "This can't be right," Clark interrupted. "Eleanor and I discuss it. My client was quite explicit," Sabrina replied coolly. "The instructions were updated 6 months ago, with 2 witnesses and a medical evaluation confirming her sound mind." Celeste's manicured nails dug into her palms. "We'll contest it." "You're welcome to try," Sabrina replied, sliding a document across the table. Mrs. Alden anticipated that response. "This is a record of transferred assets completed over the past year. The estate as defined in this will contains only 15% of her total holdings. The remainder transferred to the trust months ago." As they left the lawyer's office, Clark grabbed Gavin's arm. "This isn't over." "Actually," Gavin replied, removing Clark's hand like it was something diseased, "it's just beginning." 2 days later, Clark arrived at his downtown apartment to find the locks changed and an eviction notice posted. The building, apparently, had been owned through a shell company controlled by Eleanor's trust. When he tried accessing his bank accounts, he discovered them frozen, the result of a fraud investigation initiated by a file anonymously submitted to the Suncrest Department of Financial Services, detailing 2 decades of embezzlement from Eleanor's companies. Celeste fared no better. She returned from a lunch with her society friends to find her credit cards declined. When she called the bank in a rage, she was informed that the supplementary cards on Gavin's accounts had been canceled. Her personal accounts, primarily funded by Gavin over the years, contained barely enough to cover a month's expenses. That evening, she arrived at the Duneside mansion to find the security codes changed and her belongings packed in boxes in the garage. "You can't do this," she hissed when Gavin answered her furious pounding on the door. "Community property applies only to assets acquired during marriage," Gavin explained calmly. "This house was my mother's, now mine through the trust. Your name was never on the deed." "I need money, Gavin, be reasonable." "I'll have divorce papers drawn up," he replied. "Standard settlement, more than you deserve. And if I go public, tell people you're trying to destroy your own father, how your mother was mentally unstable at the end." Gavin smiled without warmth. "Try it. The surveillance folder makes compelling viewing. I've already shared select portions with the boards of your 3 favorite charities. Check your email. I believe your committee positions have been reconsidered." Her phone chimed as if on cue. Celeste's face drained of color as she read the messages. "You're destroying my life," she whispered. "No," Gavin corrected. "I'm simply removing what was never yours to begin with." Over the following week, Gavin methodically implemented his mother's contingency plans, while adding refinements of his own. Clark discovered he had been removed from his remaining consulting positions through a series of emails detailing ethical concerns, backed by documentation from Eleanor's files. Celeste found her social circle rapidly contracting as Gavin strategically shared evidence of her betrayal with key Highvale socialites known for their discreet but effective gossip. When Clark attempted to access funds from former business associates, they mysteriously declined after receiving anonymous documentation of his history of deception. "You've thought of everything," Miles Hinton remarked during a meeting in Gavin's office. The former security chief had continued his surveillance at Gavin's request. "Not me," Gavin replied. "My mother did. I'm just the contractor following her blueprints." "Your father's getting desperate," Miles noted. "He tried contacting several of Eleanor's old rivals yesterday. They refused him, but he'll keep trying." "Let him," Gavin said. "Each attempt only widens the net. And your son, how's he handling this?" Gavin's expression softened slightly. "Better than I expected. Stronger than I was at his age." "He's worried about you," Miles observed. "Says you're not sleeping, barely eating." "There'll be time for that later." Miles hesitated. "Eleanor asked me to tell you something if things went this way. She said, remind Gavin that demolition is only the first phase. The rebuilding is what matters." Gavin nodded, but his eyes remained cold. First things first. That evening, Gavin received a call from Clark's only remaining ally, his cousin Julian Reed. "This has gone far enough, Gavin," Julian said without preamble. "Clark's staying on my couch. He's a broken man." "Is this the part where I'm supposed to feel something?" Gavin asked. "He's your father, for God's sake." "No," Gavin replied. "He's the man who married my mother, betrayed her for decades, seduced my wife, and planned to drug me into incompetence. Biology doesn't create obligations. He wants to meet, to explain his side." Gavin considered this. "Lakeside Park, tomorrow at noon." "He comes alone." Julian sighed with relief. "Thank you. He'll be there." After hanging up, Gavin called Miles. "I need surveillance on Clark tonight. If he contacts Celeste, I want to know." "Already on it," Miles replied. "They met an hour ago at the Westgate Diner." Seemed agitated. Celeste left with a manila envelope. Gavin's eyes narrowed. Find out what was in that envelope. The next pieces were moving into position, and Gavin intended to stay 3 moves ahead. The morning of the meeting with Clark, Gavin received 2 significant calls. The first came from Sabrina Cole. "There's been a development," she said. "Clark's hired Gregory Marsh to contest the will. They're claiming Eleanor was being manipulated at the end." "By whom?" Gavin asked. "By you," Sabrina replied. "They're suggesting you coerced changes to the will while she was medicated." Gavin laughed without humor. "That's quite the accusation from the man who was planning to drug me." "They don't know we have evidence of that plan," Sabrina reminded him. "This could get messy." The second call came from Miles Hinton. "We identified what was in the envelope. Medical records, specifically prescription histories for your mother during her final months. They're going to claim she wasn't competent," Gavin concluded. "Can they make it stick?" "Unlikely," Miles replied. "Your mother was thorough. The trust modifications were made during periods when her medical records show she was lucid and unmedicated. She had independent psychological evaluations done. Still, they only need to create enough doubt to force a settlement." "No settlements," Gavin said firmly. "Not $1. At Lakeside Park, Gavin found Clark already waiting on a bench overlooking the water. His father had aged years in mere weeks, his normally immaculate appearance now disheveled, his confident posture replaced by a hunched defensiveness. "You came," Clark said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm curious what possible explanation you think could matter," Gavin replied, remaining standing. Clark sighed. "Your mother and I, our marriage wasn't what you thought. Eleanor was brilliant but cold. Calculating. She treated our relationship like another business acquisition." "Save the revisionist history," Gavin cut in. "I've read her private journals from the trust documents. She loved you despite knowing exactly who you were." Clark's expression hardened. "You've always seen her through a child's eyes. The great Eleanor Alden, infallible matriarch. She built her empire by crushing people, including me. I helped build her first development projects, my ideas, my connections. She took everything and left me as a glorified accountant. Is that how you justified stealing from her for 20 years? Clark flinched. "I took what I deserved. And Celeste, was she what you deserved too?" "Celeste came to me," Clark said, voice lowering. "She was lonely. You were always working, obsessed with the business. She needed someone who valued her." Gavin laughed bitterly. "Valued her? You used her as a pawn to access my inheritance. I read your messages plotting to simulate my mental decline. How exactly does that demonstrate value?" "That was her idea," Clark said quickly. "She thought if you were declared incompetent, control would revert to her as your wife. I just went along with it." Throwing her under the bus already, Gavin shook his head. "Pathetic, but predictable." "Listen to me." Clark leaned forward. "We can end this quietly. I'll sign whatever you want. A settlement. I made mistakes, but I'm still your father." "DNA isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card," Gavin replied. The Federal Financial Crimes Unit received an interesting package yesterday detailing your embezzlement. Your lawyer should be getting a call about that shortly. Clark's face drained of color. You wouldn't. I already did. Gavin checked his watch. In fact, they're probably executing a search warrant at Julian's apartment right now, since that's your last known address. You're destroying me, Clark whispered. No, Gavin corrected. I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference. What about Jonas? Clark tried desperately. He shouldn't lose his grandfather over this. Something dangerous flashed in Gavin's eyes. Don't you dare invoke my son's name. The same son you were willing to make an orphan through your schemes. It never would have gone that far. We'll never know, will we? Gavin stood. The divorce filing against Celeste goes public tomorrow. Your financial crimes investigation is already underway. I've declined to press charges for the murder conspiracy, as the evidence is circumstantial. That's the only mercy you'll get from me. As Gavin walked away, Clark called after him. This won't bring Eleanor back. Gavin paused but didn't turn around. No, but it will honor her final wishes. That evening, Gavin received a text from an unknown number. You destroyed Clark. I still have leverage you don't know about. Meet tomorrow, or I release it. See, Gavin showed the message to Jonas. What leverage could she possibly have? Jonas asked. Nothing, Gavin replied. It's desperation. But I'll meet her anyway. Why? Because every good demolition needs a controlled implosion for the final phase. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at the central table, once Celeste's favorite restaurant. When Gavin arrived, she was already seated, looking almost like her old self. Hair perfectly styled, makeup immaculate, posture confident. Only the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her water glass betrayed her anxiety. Thank you for coming, she said, attempting to take control of the conversation. You mentioned leverage, Gavin replied, not bothering with pleasantries. Celeste's smile tightened. Always direct. I've missed that about you. No, you haven't. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small recorder. I have Clark on tape confessing that Eleanor's trust modifications might not have been entirely her idea, that you might have influenced her decisions while she was medicated. Blackmail now. Gavin raised an eyebrow. That's a federal offense on top of everything else. Not blackmail. Celeste countered. Negotiation. I want what I'm entitled to as your wife of 18 years, 7 of which you spent sleeping with my father and plotting against me. Details. She dismissed that with a wave. The courts won't care about that. No-fault divorce state, remember. I get half of all marital assets. You've misunderstood something fundamental, Gavin said quietly. I'm not here to negotiate. He removed his phone, tapped the screen, and placed it on the table. The voice of Gregory Marsh, Clark's lawyer, filled the air between them. I cannot continue this representation, Mr. Alden. The evidence of financial crimes is overwhelming, and I cannot be party to what appears to be a conspiracy to commit fraud against the estate. Furthermore, any attempt to claim Mr. Gavin Alden influenced his mother's decisions is contradicted by extensive documentation, including video recordings of her explaining her decisions while demonstrably lucid. Celeste's face paled. You recorded this conversation. Miles did, Gavin corrected. The same way he recorded your meeting with Clark yesterday, where you concocted this blackmail attempt. The recorder in your hand contains nothing that would stand up to scrutiny. For the first time, genuine fear showed in Celeste's eyes. What do you want? Sign the divorce agreement my lawyer sent yesterday. Walk away with the settlement offered, which is more generous than you deserve. Never contact me or Jonas again. And if you refuse, Gavin leaned forward. Then I press charges for conspiracy to commit murder, using the evidence from my mother's files. The recordings of you and Clark discussing drug protocols would be particularly compelling to a jury. Celeste's hand trembled more visibly now. You wouldn't. Try me, Gavin replied, his voice devoid of emotion. She stared at him, searching for any sign of the man she'd married. Finding none, she nodded once. "I'll sign. But this isn't justice, Gavin. This is vengeance." "No," he corrected, standing to leave. "Justice is what the courts will deliver to Clark. What I've given you is mercy. Remember that." As Gavin walked out of the restaurant, he felt no satisfaction, no closure, only the cold certainty that the demolition phase was complete. What remained, he wasn't yet ready to consider. 3 weeks after the confrontation with Celeste, Gavin sat in Sabrina Cole's office reviewing the final divorce settlement. Celeste had signed without further protest, accepting the terms, a one-time payment of $2 million, less than 10% of what she might have claimed, and the vacation house in Sedona, plus her personal vehicles. In exchange, she waived all rights to Pinnacle Structures, the family home, and any future claims against Gavin or the Alden Trust. She gave in surprisingly easily. She recognized her position was untenable. Gavin replied, "Self-preservation is Celeste's defining characteristic." "And Clark?" Sabrina asked. "The federal investigation continues. His assets remain frozen. According to Miles, he's moved in with a former colleague in Stonefield." Gavin paused. "Anything else?" Sabrina hesitated. "There's something else. Clark's medical records were subpoenaed as part of the financial investigation. He's been diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer, the same disease that took your mother." Gavin's expression didn't change. "Ironic. Does it change anything for you?" "No," Gavin said after a moment. He made his choices. Later that evening, Gavin found Jonas sitting by the pool, textbooks spread around him but clearly neglected. Since Eleanor's death, Jonas had maintained perfect grades while helping Gavin sort through her records, showing a maturity beyond his years. But tonight, something was different. "Everything okay?" Gavin asked, taking the seat beside him. Jonas shrugged. "Mom called today." Gavin tensed. What did she want? To explain her side. Said she never meant for things to go as far as they did with Clark. That she still loves me. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Jonas replied. I hung up. Gavin nodded, uncertain what to say. The betrayal had been easier for him to process. He was an adult with a lifetime of experiences to contextualize it. For Jonas, the foundation of his world had crumbled without warning. "Do you think she ever loved us?" Jonas asked suddenly. "Really loved us?" Gavin considered the question carefully. "I think Celeste loves the idea of people rather than the reality. She loved what we represented, stability, status, comfort. When those things were threatened, or something more exciting came along, that love wasn't enough." "Grandma's letter said I was innocent in all this," Jonas said. "But sometimes I don't feel innocent. I saw things, moments between Mom and Clark that seemed off. I said nothing. You were a child. Are still, in many ways." Gavin placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "None of this is on you. I've been thinking about college," Jonas said, changing the subject. "Knight has an early admission program. Their architectural engineering program is top-ranked. Northwood is a long way from Highvale. Maybe that's good," Jonas suggested. "A fresh start for both of us." The idea caught Gavin off guard. Since Eleanor's death, he'd been focused solely on dismantling the betrayal, not on what came after. Northwood, the possibility stirred something he thought had died with his mother's last breath. "Hope. We'll look into it," Gavin promised. The next morning, Miles Hinton arrived with unexpected news. "Clark's medical condition has worsened," he reported. "He's been admitted to Stonefield Medical Center. Prognosis isn't good. The cancer is aggressive, just like your mother's was." Gavin absorbed this information without visible reaction. Is he receiving proper care? Basic coverage through Medicare. His friend is covering some expenses, but without access to his frozen assets. Miles trailed off. "Keep me informed," Gavin said finally. "There's more," Miles continued. "Celeste has been visiting him daily, paying for upgraded care out of her settlement money. This detail pierced Gavin's armor of indifference. Interesting. Want me to keep surveillance on them? Gavin considered, then shook his head. No, we know enough. After Miles left, Gavin found himself standing in his mother's former office, now his. The room still held echoes of Eleanor. Her collection of architectural models, her precise filing system, the view of Saddlecrest Peak. On her desk sat a small framed photo Gavin had recently rediscovered. Eleanor holding infant Gavin, with Clark standing proudly beside them, a family that never truly existed. His phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Clark asking for you. Doctors give him weeks, not months. This isn't about money anymore. See, Gavin stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. That night, he dreamed of his mother, not the frail figure from her hospital bed, but Eleanor in her prime, striding through construction sites, making decisive changes to blueprints, teaching him to identify load-bearing walls. The demolition is complete, Dream Eleanor told him. What will you build now? He woke at dawn with the question echoing in his mind. The admission letter from Knight arrived for Jonas on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 months after Eleanor's death. Full scholarship, early admission for the fall semester. Congratulations, Gavin said, genuine pride warming his voice for the first time in months. Your grandmother would have been ecstatic. I know, Jonas replied quietly. I wish she could have seen it. They celebrated with dinner at Jonas's favorite steakhouse. For a few hours, the weight of betrayal lifted, allowing glimpses of what their future might hold. During dessert, Jonas broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. Clark doesn't have much time left, he said. Miles told me yesterday. Gavin's expression closed. Miles shouldn't have involved you. I asked him, Jonas admitted. I wanted to know. It changes nothing. Maybe not for you. Jonas looked steadily at his father. But I've been thinking about what Grandma wrote, about protecting me because I'm innocent in this. What if that protection includes protecting me from regrets later? Gavin set down his fork. What are you suggesting? That I want to see him. Once. Before he dies. Jonas held up a hand before Gavin could protest. Not to forgive him. Just to understand. And to close that chapter before I leave for college. The request caught Gavin off guard. Part of him wanted to refuse outright, to protect his son from further pain. But the maturity in Jonas's eyes gave him pause. I'll consider it, Gavin said finally. 3 days later, Gavin drove Jonas to Stonefield, mostly in silence, each lost in private thoughts. At Stonefield Medical Center, Gavin waited in the corridor, while Jonas entered Clark's room alone. 30 minutes later, Jonas emerged, his expression unreadable. He's asked to see you, Jonas said. I told him you probably wouldn't come. But he insisted. Did you get what you needed? Gavin asked. Jonas considered the question. Not answers. There aren't any that would make sense. But closure, maybe. Gavin nodded. Wait here. Clark Alden barely resembled the man who had stood at Eleanor's funeral 6 months earlier. Cancer had hollowed his cheeks and yellowed his skin. Tubes connected him to various machines, tracking his decline. His eyes, however, retained their sharpness as they fixed on Gavin. I didn't think you'd come, Clark said, his voice raspy. I'm here for Jonas, not you. Clark nodded weakly. He's a good kid, better than either of us deserved. Speak for yourself. A ghost of a smile touched Clark's lips. Still no forgiveness. You really are your mother's son. Is that why you called me in here? For absolution. No, Clark replied. For truth. Sit down, Gavin. Please. Against his better judgment, Gavin took the chair beside the bed. I won't apologize for what I did, Clark began. Not because I don't recognize it was wrong, but because apologies are worthless against actions like mine. Finally, something we agree on. Your mother knew about my embezzlement from the beginning, Clark continued. Did you know that? She caught me 6 months into our marriage. She could have turned me in, divorced me, ruined me. Instead, She limited my access, monitored every transaction, and kept me. Gavin frowned. Why would she do that? Because Eleanor understood something fundamental about people. We're all broken, just in different ways. She saw my weakness for what it was, a man who never felt he measured up, always grasping for validation through money, power, conquests. That doesn't excuse. I'm not offering excuses, Clark interrupted. Only context. I failed as a husband, a father, and a man. The affair with Celeste began because we recognized similar brokenness in each other, constant need for more. Spare me the psychoanalysis, Gavin said coldly. Clark continued as if he hadn't spoken. What I need you to understand is this. Your mother kept me around partly to protect you from the truth about who I was, and partly because, despite everything, she loved me. Not the man I was, but the man she believed I could be. I failed her faith spectacularly. Is this supposed to make me feel something? Pity? Understanding? Clark's breathing grew labored. Your mother never acted against me despite knowing everything. She chose a different path. She chose life. Creation over destruction. She chose weakness. No, Clark countered. She chose mercy. The trust arrangements, the evidence she gathered, those were protection, not annihilation. You've taken them further. You've become terrifying in your efficiency. Gavin's eyes flashed. You plotted to simulate my mental decline, to take everything I'd built. Yes, Clark acknowledged. And there's no justification for that. But there is a warning. Revenge consumes the vessel that carries it. Your mother understood this. You're dying, Gavin observed, trying to rewrite your legacy. I have no legacy, Clark replied. Only regrets, and a son who hates me, with complete justification. He coughed weakly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to consider what comes after the demolition. Eleanor would want you to build something new, not spend your life guarding the ashes. The door opened as Celeste returned with coffee. She froze upon seeing Gavin, coffee cups clutched in white-knuckled hands. I'll leave you to your conspirator, Gavin said, standing. She's paying for my care with her settlement money, Clark said quietly. No obligation to do so. No benefit to herself. Honor among thieves. Clark shook his head weakly. Complicated truths, Gavin. Life is full of them. Your mother understood that better than anyone. As Gavin reached the door, Clark called after him. The inheritance that matters isn't in the trust, son. It's in what Eleanor taught you about building things that last. Celeste stepped aside silently as Gavin passed, their eyes meeting briefly. In hers, Gavin saw not the calculation or manipulation he expected, but simple exhaustion and something that might have been regret. In the corridor, Jonas waited, watching his father's face carefully. Did you get what you needed? Jonas asked, echoing Gavin's earlier question. No, Gavin replied honestly. But I got something to think about. On the drive back to Highvale, with Jonas asleep in the passenger seat, Gavin's thoughts returned to his mother's letter. Remember what I taught you about foundations. Theirs is built on sand. All you need to do is direct the tide. For the first time, he wondered if he had misunderstood her meaning entirely. Clark Alden died on a Thursday in May with Celeste at his bedside. Gavin received the news from Miles with a simple nod of acknowledgement. No tears, no visible reaction. He did not attend the sparsely populated funeral. 2 weeks later, as Gavin reviewed expansion plans for Pinnacle Structures' entry into the Northwood market, his assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Alden is here to see you, sir. Celeste stood in his office doorway, thinner than he remembered, her usual perfect appearance slightly subdued. She carried a small box. Thank you for seeing me, she said. Her customary confidence was notably absent. Russ, Clark had these in his possession. I thought they should go to you and Jonas. She placed the box on his desk. Gavin made no move to open it. Is that all? No, Celeste admitted, remaining standing though Gavin had not invited her to sit. I came to tell you, I'm leaving Highvale. Moving to Bayville, where my sister lives. Your settlement money should last longer there, Gavin observed coolly. A flash of the old Celeste surfaced. I'm not here for more money. Contrary to what you believe, I'm not completely mercenary. Evidence suggests otherwise. She sighed. I deserve that. But people can be more than one thing, Gavin. I can be both the woman who betrayed you and someone capable of caring for a dying man who had no one else. Touching redemption story. Not redemption, Celeste corrected. Reality. I loved you once, before ambition and boredom corrupted it. I loved Jonas always, still do, though I've lost the right to be his mother. I never planned to hurt either of you physically. The dementia scheme was Clark's darkest idea, one I agreed to in a moment of desperation that I've regretted every day since. Is this the part where I'm supposed to forgive you? No, she replied simply. I don't expect or deserve forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that beneath the horrible choices I made, there was once something real. She gestured to the box. Clark kept every drawing and school project you ever made. Every Father's Day card, every newspaper clipping about your success. Whatever his failures, and they were monumental. Some part of him was proud of you. Pride without integrity is meaningless, Gavin said. Perhaps Celeste nodded. But we're all made of contradictions, even you. She moved toward the door. I've told Jonas I'm leaving. Wished him well at night. I won't contact either of you again unless you reach out first. After she left, Gavin stared at the box for a long time before finally opening it. Inside lay dozens of yellowed drawings, school awards, photos, and news clippings spanning decades, a paper trail of a childhood and career meticulously preserved. At the bottom, he found a sealed envelope addressed to him in his mother's handwriting, dated just days before her death. My dearest Gavin, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth about Clark and Celeste, and they have faced the consequences of their actions. I have no doubt you implemented the protective measures I prepared with precision. You've always been methodical in everything you do. What you may not understand is why I kept Clark in my life, knowing what he was. The answer is complex, but it begins with recognizing that people are rarely entirely good or entirely evil. Clark was weak, selfish, and sometimes ruthless. But he was also the young man who once stayed up all night finishing my first project models when the deadline seemed impossible. He was the father who taught you to ride a bike when I was too busy with the business. He was a man of profound flaws who occasionally rose above them. I stayed with him partly to protect you from scandal, partly because I understood his weaknesses intimately, and yes, partly because despite everything, some ember of love remained, not every day, and never blindly, but enough to make me choose monitoring over destruction. Now you face a similar choice in the aftermath of betrayal. You can spend years ensuring Clark and Celeste never rise again, guarding against every possible resurgence of their influence. Or you can recognize that true power lies not in destruction, but creation, building something so magnificent that the betrayal becomes merely a footnote in your story. Your foundation is not built on sand, my son. It is built on everything I tried to teach you about integrity, resilience, and the courage to begin again after loss. Whatever you choose, know that I am proud of the man you've become and confident in the man you will yet be. With eternal love, Mom. The letter slipped from Gavin's fingers as he leaned back in his chair, looking out at the Highvale skyline his mother had helped shape. For the first time since her death, he felt something in his chest loosen. Not forgiveness for the betrayers, but release from the grip of vengeance that had consumed him. He picked up the phone and called Jonas. I've been thinking about Northwood, he said when his son answered. About relocating Pinnacle Structures headquarters eventually. New markets, new challenges. Really? Jonas sounded cautiously excited. What changed your mind? Gavin's eyes fell on his mother's letter. I'm ready to build something new. 2 months later, as summer heat baked the Suncrest dunes, Gavin and Jonas stood at the ceremonial groundbreaking for Pinnacle Structures' most ambitious project yet. Eleanor Place, a mixed-use development combining affordable housing, business incubator spaces, and community facilities. As cameras captured Gavin's speech, he looked out at the gathered crowd. Business associates, employees, friends who had stood by him through the scandal, and felt the weight of the past year shifting into something different. Not forgotten, not diminished, but transformed into foundation rather than burden. My mother taught me that true strength lies not just in what we build, but in why we build it, he told the audience. Eleanor Place represents a new beginning, not just for Pinnacle Structures, but for me personally. That evening, as he and Jonas reviewed preliminary housing options for Naiti, Gavin's phone chimed with a text from Miles Hinton. Celeste boarded her flight to Bayville this morning. Clark's remaining assets unfrozen by federal investigators. Minimal value recovered. Chapter closed. Gavin read the message, then deleted it without response. Everything okay, Dad? Jonas asked. Yes, Gavin replied, surprised to find he meant it. Just the past making its final exit. He would never forgive Clark or Celeste for their betrayal. The pain they caused would always remain part of his story. But as Eleanor had understood, some foundations could be salvaged even after catastrophic damage. Reinforced, redesigned, repurposed into something stronger than before. Gavin Alden had always been a builder. Now, surrounded by the blueprints of his future spread across the table, he finally understood that the most important reconstruction had been his own.